Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the webinar this evening, which has been hosted by AHDB. And tonight we'll be discussing the RamCompare project 2021 results. My name is Chloe McKee and I'm the Knowledge Transfer Officer for Beef and Lamb, and our presenter this evening is Sam Boone. Sam works at AHDB as the Manager of Cygnet Breeding Services. We're also joined this evening by Bridget Lloyd, RamCompare Project Coordinator, and Bridget will be able to assist with any questions this evening. So the plan of action tonight is that Sam will take us through a 35-minute presentation, and during the presentation we have a couple of polls for you to join in with. And as usual, you will all be muted throughout the webinar and there will be time for questions at the end. So if you'd like to ask a question, please type it into the question box on the right-hand side of your screen, and then when Sam has finished presenting, I can ask those questions. If you can't see this box, you may need to click on the orange arrow to open up the control panel, then click on the questions drop down and you'll see where you can type your question in. You can type your questions in at any time, and if you're watching us through a mobile or tablet this evening, your questions box will be at the bottom of the screen with a question mark icon. And please also use this box to let me know if you're having any technical problems, and I'll do my best to help. The usual advice is to log out and come back in. So thank you, Sam. I'll hand over now to you to introduce yourself and begin this evening's webinar.
Thank you very much indeed. Lovely. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to you about RamCompare. I can't believe this is the 5th year's worth of results that we're talking about. And this is actually quite an exciting time because it's the end of the first and second phases of the project, and we're just about to embark on the next phase, phase 3. So it's a massive project, and I need to mention the fact that it's been funded from a number of different sources, with many collaborators and many supporters along the way, without whom this project wouldn't be possible. So my name's Sam Boone. This is a rare picture of me out on farm last year. And as Chloe said, I'm the Manager of Cygnet Breeding Services. I spend a lot of time delivering the national sheep evaluations within the UK, and do a little bit of work on the beef side as well as adding to AHDB's portfolio of genetic research. Now, while I might be the face of the project, I think we can all acknowledge that it's actually Bridget Lloyd that does all the work. So Bridget runs RamCompare for us, as well as a couple of other projects, and her contact details are there should you wish to give her a shout for clarity on any particular items. We've also got a Twitter feed for RamCompare that you can use tonight if you wish, and all of the information about RamCompare is also up on the Cygnet website, so that's a good source of knowledge as well. So as an overview for tonight's presentation, we're going to talk about the 5 years worth of data that we've collected so far. We're going to talk about case studies from a couple of our farms. So we've actually written up 6 case studies within the new results booklet. I'm just going to share a couple of those with you tonight. And then most importantly, we're going to talk about the main messages for commercial ram buyers, how you can use this information when you're out selecting rams for your farms. So the RamCompare project is a national progeny test. So we take a range of Terminal Sire breeds and we send them out onto commercial farms, either through natural service or AI. We make them to commercial use, we measure the lambs that are produced, and then we follow those lambs right the way through to the abattoir, collecting as much data on them as we can so that we can understand about the genetic differences between sires. So the aims of the project initially were to produce new estimated breeding values for carcass traits. That was to develop tools that would help commercial producers to get more lambs in spec. It was enabling us to compare recorded rams under very much commercial sheep production conditions. And the project also started at about the time we were bringing in the new mixed breed national terminal sire evaluation. And so this data was really useful for validating that, strengthening the linkage between breeds, and also enabling us to pull commercial data into our pedigree evaluations. In addition to that, it's been a useful project for demonstrating the commercial value of recorded rams on commercial farms. So it had a number of aims, and I have to say it's been used for a number of other spin-off projects and bits of research along the way. The project would be nothing without our farmers, to whom we're greatly indebted. We had 7 farmers working with us last year. We've got recent Russell Edwards across in South Wales, Ian, ably supported by Bella, his daughter, across at Chawton Park in Hampshire, Coombe family down in Cornwall. We've got Richard Parry across in Suffolk in East Anglia. We've got Mark Exelby across in Yorkshire. Duncan Nelless is up in Northumberland, and Sean Williams across at Bow Hill Estate. So you can see we cover a fair bit of the country as we charge about working with these individual farmers, and they've done a fantastic job for us over the last 12 months. It's a massive project. It's probably one of the biggest that we've been involved with, and one of the bigger projects in Europe, I would imagine. We've actually worked with 12 different farms over the 5 years. We've tested over 26,000 lambs, and we've managed to progeny test over 280 rams from 11 different breeds. During that time, we've produced 8 new breeding values for abattoir-derived traits, and in addition to that, the on-farm data has gone into the National Terminal Sire evaluation to enhance that. So this is a project with real scale in terms of the amount of data that we've got. And if anything, we've exceeded our expectations in terms of testing rams. At the start of the project, I hope to get 25 or 30 progeny by each of these rams. We've exceeded that for nearly all of them, and many of them have gone on to have 80, 90, 100 plus. I'll very quickly skip through the data collection. We start off obviously with insemination for the AI and natural service. Then we're collecting pregnancy scanning data. At lambing time, we're extremely busy, or the farmers are extremely busy, collecting data on birth weight, on lambing ease, and we also want to know about lamb mortality as well. So we want to know about those elements of lamb production. Lambs are weighed at around 8 weeks of age, which is the same sort of time as the signet recorded flocks. And then just as we approach the first draw at about 90 to 100 days of age, we weigh the lambs again and we charge in with the ultrasound scanner, and my scanning team will measure muscle and fat depth across the loin for those lambs. Then as we get to slaughter time, obviously lambs will go off in batches throughout the year, and on a subset of those animals, we'll also be collecting information on tenderness, so an indicator of meat eating quality, and also on primal yield. So we're breaking down some of these carcasses into the primal weights, and I'll talk about that as well. So a tremendous amount of data being collected from birth right the way through to slaughter. Right, Chloe, I think we're going to do a quick poll at this stage, if you're ready. So I think we're going to be talking about how do people actually buy their rams. So I'm informed that the
hopefully you can see that on screen.
Lovely. I can't, but I'm assuming that other people can. So it says the poll is open.
Brilliant.
So we've got 3 questions. So how do you buy your rams? Is it directly from a breeder? Is it via an auction, or is it both? So one of the questions that mirrors our sheep breed survey questions as it happens. So I'll give you a little bit of time to answer that.
There we are, Sam. The results are on screen now.
Right.
42% of our audience this evening buy directly from a breeder, 47% buy directly from a breeder and an auction, and 11% just from an auction.
Okay, so that's a slightly higher proportion that are buying direct from breeders compared to the sheep breed survey, as it happens, which was more or less, certainly for the larger flocks, is about a third, a third, a third. And then if you move into specific sectors, such as the hill sector, well, then you actually have about 60% of people buying from auctions. So all or both of those mechanisms are still extremely important ways that people are purchasing rams at the moment. Would you like to put up the next one for me, Chloe? So second poll question. If you could enhance one attribute when buying a ram through his genetics, what would it be? And the answers that are available, you can only choose one. You can't tick the lot, at least I don't think you can. So reducing days to slaughter, increasing carcass weights, producing leaner lambs, enhancing lamb carcass conformation, and improving tenderness. Which of those would be top of your shopping list? And have we got that poll open, Chloe?
Yes, I'm just nearly at full vote, so just give everyone a couple more seconds.
That's fine.
There we are. Share those results now. So
Lovely. Do you want to read them out to me?
Thanks, Sam. So 53% of the audience would like to enhance reducing days to slaughter, followed by 32% are enhancing lamb carcass conformation. Next, 11% increasing carcass weights, 3% improving tenderness, and 1% producing leaner lambs.
Lovely. So that's really interesting. I think if we'd done that a few more years ago, when I started my career, crikey, 20 years ago, that we're doing a lot more interest in or concerns about fatness and desire to produce leaner lambs. That's something that we've made great strides to improve through selection for growth and for muscling. Tenderness is obviously of interest, but the challenge there is always within the supply chain. How can you actually be rewarded for those improvements? And so reducing days to slaughter, I'm not too surprised to see that being such a major part of people's objectives. And the nice thing is that's a relatively straightforward one to make improvements with, as I'll talk about in a moment. So thank you. So that leads me quite nicely into thinking about why we have this project and talking about the challenge that you have as ram buyers. So you've talked about the attributes that you get paid on in terms of carcass weight, conformation, fat class, and the impact of days to slaughter. But when you actually go shopping, the information you have available to select rams is about scan weight, muscle depth and fat depth, which we assess using ultrasound, or indeed some of the CT-derived traits. And what we need to know about is how good a predictor are they of on-farm performance. How can we update our knowledge to make them better predictions, and how can we improve them? And also, how can we demonstrate the link to those that have not used the information before when it comes to selecting their rams? So the RamCompare project is all about pulling together those two pieces of knowledge. What does it mean for the commercial buyer? Well, last year, I know you were delighted that I used about 9 different graphs and charts to show you genetic correlations between all of these different attributes. But the reality is that it can be summarized quite neatly with a single table. So 5 years worth of data collection shows us the link between the estimated breeding values and then the breeding goals that you have on farm. And we can see that for increasing on-farm growth rates and for reducing days to slaughter, then the scan weight EBV does a really good job. It tends to have a lower link or a less clear link with carcass weight. So if we want to improve carcass weights, a high scan weight EBV will help, but you'll also be looking at some of the muscling traits as well in conjunction with that. And maybe that's one of the slightly more surprising results, that the link between scan weight and carcass weight isn't perhaps quite as strong as we would expect, and we do need this other information. There's a good relationship between muscle depth, considering it's a single measurement across the loin, and overall carcass conformation. And there's a really strong link between the fat depth, EBV, and carcass fat class. Those breeding values are available for all of the breeds that record with us, but there'll be some breeds that are making really quite good use of the CT scanner as well. So the CT scanner is something that's levy funded. to take measurements on some of the elite ram lambs within the population. And from that, we know that the breeding values for lean weight help us to improve carcass conformation. And indeed, the Jigget EBV that we get through the CT scanner, again, has a really good link with carcass conformation, just as the CT fat weight EBV that's published is a pretty good predictor of carcass fat class. So it is enabling us to produce leaner lambs should we wish to do that. So there's a really clear link there between the breeding values that we produce for rams and the breeding goals on farm. I'll give you a couple of examples from our trials this year. So we'll start off in Northumberland with some of the data on Duncan Nelless's farm. So Duncan's using Terminal Sires on his clean ewes up there. And this is the information for carcass conformation for a range of different rams. And you can actually see them ordered on the basis of their breeding value for carcass conformation. So there's quite a big difference there between the higher and the lower performing sires. I think it's worth highlighting that nearly all of the grades are coming back as R or better. So that tells us a little bit about the system and the ewes that are being used, but it still shows that there's some variation between sires that can be exploited. So we've got, I think it's Fourroy's Tempest, Charolais ram at the top of the list. And then amongst the Charolais and the meat links, we've also got a Mizzen Blue Texel that's sitting there performing extremely well. So the genetic merit of the sires will influence carcass conformation, and we can also see that seeking rams with high breeding values for muscling traits is going to help us in that respect. If we come a little further south to Mark Exelby down in Yorkshire, this example is talking a little bit more about carcass weight. So we've got the breeding value of the sires for carcass weight along the bottom. We've got the average carcass weight of their progeny on the y-axis. And you can see there that you'd predict a difference of a couple of kilos in terms of breeding potential for carcass weight amongst the sires. And indeed, that's the variation that we observed amongst the progeny. So the top of this list is a ram called Callerton Bugatti, a Texel from the Hobbs family, put forward on test, and we'll hear a bit more about him later. But he performed extremely well on this particular farm. So again, quite a bit of variation that we can exploit. And indeed, I've even put in smaller figures there, the additional financial value relative to the flock average of using that particular sire. So carcass weights can be influenced through sire selection, and we can easily see differences of 3, 4, 5 pounds a head through that selection. If we head to Ian's farm down in Hampshire, Ian, again with the Clin flock, May lambing, so grass early on, but towards the end of the summer in a more challenging year, then that grass will disappear fairly fast. So the sooner he can get lambs away and off the farm, the more forage is freed up for the rest of the flock. And we can see quite big differences in this unit in terms of days to slaughter. So we've got days to slaughter along the bottom, looking for negative values here, indicating rams whose progeny will finish more quickly. And you can see differences of actually for a couple of weeks between the progeny of these Hampshire and Suffolk rams on this particular unit and some of the other rams on the system. So quite big differences. And obviously at the end of the day, Ian sits down and he looks at what it's worth getting these lambs away more quickly versus the overall value of their individual carcasses. But what we have seen is that the rams with high EBVs for scan weight are very much producing faster finishing lambs. And that's all well and good talking about performance of lambs and what we observe, but at the end of the day, it's the financial differences that interest us. And I very quickly plotted the average value of a ram's progeny for 4 of the different farms versus his overall genetic merit. And we can comfortably see differences of £3.50 a lamb, more in many cases, between the higher and the lower performing sires, bearing in mind that the rams that we put on test tended to be at the higher end of the scale in terms of their genetic merit. So £3.50 a lamb benefit, or we could say £5 a ewe benefit from using these rams might not sound a great deal, but multiply that up over their working lifetime, and this is easily worth an extra £900, £1,000 a ram, simply by shopping around and finding the ram with the right genetics for your particular production system. So it's an opportunity that's worth taking up. That's a little bit about the financial messages from this year's results. I'll just walk through some of the tables of results for 2020. If you download the full results from the internet, what you'll see there is not just the 2020 results, but also a summary of the last 5 years. So there's a lot more information within the published booklet. This is just some of the edited highlights. So in terms of the scan weight EBV, the top couple of rams for 2020 was the Kelsey Brahma, a Hampshire Down that's been used down in Cornwall, and also one of the Anta Texel rams that came across and that we've used in Wales. Extremely high growth rates being served by those couple of sires. If we move on to muscle depth, we've got a Suffolk from the autumn flock of Richard Garner, was top for 2020. And many of you remember that actually we had an autumn Suffolk top within the 2019 list as well, again from Richard. So got a couple of Suffolks performing well there amongst a couple of the Texel rams on this list. But you can see we don't have one breed dominating these tables. We tend to have several different breeds within the listings. If we have a look at the fat depth results, if we're looking at some of the leaner sires, again, we've got a range of breeds there within the listing, remembering that this is on a weight adjusted basis that we're now looking at both muscle depth and fat depth. So we've got a Texel at the top of the list there in terms of overall leanness. Days to slaughter. So last year we had a Hampshire Down at the top of the list, and actually this year we've got several Hampshire Downs within the top 10. We can see 3 here within the top 4. Extremely fast growth rates, and those rams were producing lambs that were able to get away extremely fast under last year's production systems. So several of those in there, but plenty of other breeds in the mix at the same time. So carcass weight, we talked about Callerton Bugatti. He was actually a stand-in. We had a ram that we were unable to get semen from, and the Hobbs family were chatting to me and said, we've got a fantastic ram, you really got to use him. If you can possibly get him onto the trial this year, please do. And I think they'll be delighted that we did manage it, and it performed extremely well. So we've got several Texels here ranking highly for their overall carcass weight. And we've got the Charolais from Neil Orton also in the mix. And in terms of carcass conformation, we've got a range of breeds at the top. We've certainly got several Charolais on the top table. And actually Charles and Stephen Marwood, who are based in Yorkshire, have bred a couple of the top Charolais this year, with Four-Royce Tempest that Andrew Walton put forward, taking the top slot. So we've also got blue Texels and Beltex featuring strongly in those top listings. In terms of fat class EBV, well, we've got a range of breeds listed amongst the leaner genetics. Certainly got a meat link that's at the top of the list, but we've got several other both continental and native breeds within that listing. So perhaps not a big surprise that Callerton Bugatti is top in terms of his overall carcass merit. He had a breeding value for carcass weight nearly ½ a kilo heavier than the rest of the sires on test last year, and that accounts for a tremendous amount when you add that weight in. We've got Charolais and Beltex amongst the list as well, in terms of in part because of their conformation. But what we should remember is that the carcass merit index for RamCompare is solely based on the value of the carcass, At the moment, it doesn't take into account days to slaughter. It might in the future, but at the moment it's solely looking at the value. And obviously on any farm, you've got to take both of those attributes into account. In terms of the work that we've done on primals, despite the various COVID challenges, we were still able to break down the carcasses and look at the weights of the primals relative to the weight of the overall carcass. So we can see that the Anta texel that we had from Ibis was actually the top ram when it came to his haunch weight relative to the overall weight of the carcass. So we had a couple of texels in there. We also got a couple of Hampshire Downs that were scoring highly for that attribute. And I think what I probably should say, just take a step back for a moment. I'm presenting 5 years worth of data on this particular table. So the previous tables were all about last year, but this is a summary of 5 years worth of data, hence 2016 to 2020. In terms of leading the pack for loin weight, well, the South Down that was top last year has yet to be beaten, the ram from Rob Beaumont, but we've got several Hampshire Downs, which also tend to have good deep loins and particularly long carcasses. And so on a weight adjusted basis, we'll tend to have a lot of meat within the loin. And then in terms of meat in the chest, so in the front of the carcass, again, in this case, we've got a range of breeds that are scoring highly. And so we've got a Barnage Texel top of that overall list. So that's a little bit of the work that we've done on primals. This is be the last year that we are completing the primal work as part of RamCompare. One piece of work we still have to do is our work on shear force. So it's one of the things we were not able to do this year because of COVID to be able to do that safely, but the samples are safe. They're in the freezer as we would normally have the samples, and later on this autumn, when life is a little easier, we'll complete the shear force. So at the moment, the Charolais still hold top spot on the basis that we've not been able to update this year's information. So that's all dead exciting. We all like to know which ram is top and who's bred it and where can we find it. But actually, there are more important messages than that. The important bit really is that there are genetic differences between these rams, that the differences can be predicted using their estimated breeding values, and that the estimated breeding values that you have when you head out onto farm to buy a ram are good predictors of lamb performance. So that's where we were for last year. What's happening in 2021? Well, we had an interesting period. The formal side of the project came to a close in 2020, and we were having a bit of a review of all of AHDB's research with a plan for a bit of an interim year. However, the farmers were extremely keen, having invested all this time and effort, that we should keep the project running while we sorted out the next phase of funding. And so thanks to their goodwill and support, we've managed to keep the project going last year. So the farmers have very kindly agreed to keep single sire mating. We weren't able to do AI, but they've single sire mated, and we'll keep the data flowing next year. Various breeders rang me asking what were the next steps for the project, and offering rams and making rams available to the project to keep it going. Offers that I'm extremely grateful for, and we actually managed to get some funding, small amount of funding from HCC and AHDB to keep that element of the project going last year. So despite the fact it was supposed to be our quiet fallow year, we've got another 4,500 lambs heading into the database this year, and we've got about 33 new sires in addition to a lot of repeat sires being retested. So I'm delighted to say that the project is still very much going strong. If you want to have a quick look at the rams that are being used and the people that put them forwards to keep us going, we've got a list here. There's quite a few Charolais. That's not a coincidence. Andrew Walton and Jamie Wild have been very supportive of the project, running their own RamCompare mini project alongside, which we analyse. And so a great way of creating linkage between all these flocks that are keeping recording through natural service was to get some Charolais rams out from them. and they were very keen to support us and help us to do that. But I had many rams from many breeds and different sources, and I'm very grateful to the people that put those forward, and they'll join at least a dozen of the previous year's sires in this year's lamb crop. So phase 3, we've got some funding from AHDB, HCC and QMS to keep things moving through phase 3. The next phase of the project is very much about broadening the scope of data collection. So the first 2 phases have been looking at detail, particularly looking at primals and shear force. But this is very much about extending the scope of the project and looking at as many different sources of abattoir data as we can get. So we're bringing in new farms. I've been heading cautiously out and about in the last couple of weeks to see new farms that will be joining the project. And we're also opening up to have more breed-specific bolt-on projects, a bit like RamCompare, where the breeders actually choose the rams that they want to test, and we support that. And also looking at data sets where the farmers are actually choosing the rams that they want to test, but are providing the data to RamCompare to be analysed as part of that. So we're widening the scope. I guess the long-term vision is to try and move from having 2 separate analyses, one for carcass traits and one which is the national terminal sire evaluation, into a single analysis. So building correlations between traits. And that will be quite an exciting next step, which I'm hoping will be over the next couple of years. In addition to that, we really ought to be getting some of this information available online rather than just the sort of end of season PDF publications. So quite a bit of work to do. I haven't mentioned RamCompare in any great detail, but that project still goes strong. If you want more information, there's an AHDB podcast that you can listen to, or you can read about that. But here we've got an example where a group of breeders are specifically testing Charolais rams. They've had the data under the belts for a couple of seasons, and they're actually able to use that information within the ram selection decisions that they're making to benefit their commercial customers. So that's a really nice sort of spin-off from the initial RamCompare remit, and I suspect we'll be doing more of that within the future. So finding rams in 2021, well, in addition to going direct to breeders and heading to auctions, I suspect there'll be quite a bit more information online this season, just as there was last year. So you've got sources of breeding information via signatdata.com, the Texel website and the Innovis website, where you'll find information about performance recorded genetics and breeders. If you head to the Signet website, you'll see that we've developed Flock Finder, where you can put your postcode in and the breed of interest, and it'll tell you, as the crow flies, where your nearest breeders are. And the sheep for sale section actually had a lot of rams on it last year, and I'm anticipating the same in the coming year. So you can head to the sheep for sale section and you'll see a number of animals that are listed, and you'll always see their latest information because that's being pulled from the monthly genetic analyses for terminal sires. If you'd like more information on how to use the information, on the Signet website, we've got a couple of short YouTube clips, so on how to buy a Signet recorded ram, and indeed there's a couple more clips on there which are talking about some of the things we've learned from RamCompare, so those might be of interest to you. We have been recruiting new flocks, so although the application for that has closed, and I think we found a couple of excellent flocks to join us next year, that will be an ongoing process. So if you're sitting at home and thinking, well, actually I can single sire mate and I can provide abattoir data to be analysed by this project, well, it might be something that you want to get involved with in the future years. Those opportunities will arise, and I think probably have a chat with Bridget as the best way to take that forward. We've opened RAM nominations. We're doing it online this year, and we've had a really good response to date. I just cheekily put up a list of the rams that we've either had via semen or natural service that have been nominated to date. And although it's the closing date of the 14th of May, again, we thought that was a bit daft to close it for tonight's presentation. So you've got another week if you want to head out into your fields and have a think about if you've got rams that you would like to put forward. Particularly if you see your breed isn't particularly strongly represented, it could be quite a good opportunity to have a think about the type of rams that you could put forward. So that's for the nomination process for this year. So to summarise, RamCompare, I've talked about it being a national progeny test for terminal sires. We're now 5 years in. We've got some very strong messages about the relationship between the breeding merit of rams coming on to test and how we can use that information. If anything, it's shown the massive variation that exists within breeds. We often get very hung up on which breed will do a certain job, but there's a lot of variation within breeds and opportunities to select within those. So I would encourage people, obviously, to use breeding values when making their selection decisions this season. And if Chloe will permit me, I'll just do a very quick advert. So amongst other things that I'm involved with, the sheep breed survey, I know a few of you have asked, when can you see results from that? We actually had a record number of surveys in compared to what we were expecting. So had about 7,500 surveys in from commercial sheep farmers. So unsurprisingly, we've got Jeff Pollitt is still analysing that data, but I'm hoping to get that this summer. AgResearch have got an event on that they've just recently been talking about. So that's the 28th of June. I'm sure RamCompare will slip into that presentation, but you've also got some other fantastic speakers that you can listen to. And this wouldn't be complete without giving a nod to Sheep Breeders Roundtable, which is going to go online for a series of short presentations in the evening this November before we're all back together under one roof for a traditional Sheep Breeders Roundtable conference. So thank you for that, and I will hand back to Chloe.
Thank you, Sam. I'd just like to highlight a few things to our audience this evening. So the resources that Sam has just mentioned will be available in the follow-up email, along with the link to this webinar in the next couple of days. And we also have a feedback form which pops up once you leave this webinar, and we'd be really grateful if you have time to fill that in, please, before you go, so we can improve these events. So please do let us know what you think. So we have a couple of questions, Sam.
Lovely.
If scan muscle and fat depths are well linked to the conformation and fat class at slaughter, 3-star or 4-star, do we really need to also do CT, which is more expensive and difficult to do?
They're a good predictor, but CT is a lot more accurate for certain traits. It's particularly good for assessing jigget. And you're essentially going from something that gives you a sort of 65–70% prediction of muscling, albeit we can do hundreds of lambs in a day relatively cheaply, which is the beauty, to something that gives you sort of 97% accuracy compared to killing that animal and dissecting it tissue by tissue. So the beauty of CT is it does give you that added level of accuracy, and that's why it's quite nice that our breeders will often put forward, let's say, their top 5 ram lambs to find the very best one that they want to take semen from. CT also enables us to have predictions of things like spine length, vertebrae number, intramuscular fat. So there are some additional sort of free measurements that we get and can use in our analyses. But I think having both is important. And actually what this work's showing is, in an ideal world, we still need those abattoir phenotypes. It isn't a perfect relationship. The best way to predict carcass weight would be to get carcass weight direct from the abattoir, but CT and ultrasound head us in the right direction for sure.
Thanks, Sam. The next one is, when looking at days to slaughter, what carcass weight is the target? Different targets might give different results.
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess we're assuming relatively linear growth at that time. And so there isn't a target per se. We're obviously adjusting the lamb's measurement for the weight of that carcass. So effectively, we're taking carcass weight into account so that all the animals are on the level playing field. But I think if you were drawing lambs at a relatively lightweight, or you were drawing them at a heavier weight, the ranking in terms of days to slaughter would be relatively similar. I think the only thing you would perhaps watch a little more closely is if you were taking them to heavier weights, you'd be more conscious about the fat depth EBVs. You would be more concerned about animals with quite positive fats if you wanted to take them to very big carcass weights, because that might force you to kill them a little earlier if they look like they're going over in terms of fat, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Sam, that's great. And the next one is, will the AHDB trial in Northern Ireland embrace other breeds this year?
So that's run successfully for just a couple of years. That was a very distinct timeline within that project. And obviously they've bolted other exciting things onto that work, such as work with feed efficiency. Chatting to friends in Northern Ireland about how we can sort of embrace data from there, I think the route that we're probably going to take is moving away from using AHDB data directly and bringing in data from commercial farms in Northern Ireland. So I am chatting to people in Northern Ireland about that. They've got their successful Beacon Farm project, which has a lot of farms, I know, but actually some of those are looking to single sire mate. They're looking to send the data through, and they're looking to include that as part of this project, which will be very welcome. So I think that's the direction of travel for Northern Irish data.
Thanks, Sam. And how do you factor in breeder view into the data?
On the farms, uniformity of the breeder view is really quite important. So very happy to go into a flock of North Country mules, very happy to go into a flock of Clins. Where I would be slightly more concerned is if we were working with a flock, and particularly if they had lots of continental genetics in there, in some of them and not in others, particularly where you've got the major muscling genes floating about. That could create more of a challenge. So we only work with flocks with a relatively uniform ewe breed in the background that helps to do that. The other thing, Chloe, I'd quickly say is that we also use the powers of numbers a little bit. So the ewes are randomly put to sires, and it's not like they're getting 10 each. For natural service, they're getting sort of 40, 50, 60 plus. So if there's a bit of variation between individual ewes, it does sort itself out in the wash.
Thanks, Sam. And the next one is scan weight and growth weight included in the overall carcass merit?
No, it isn't. That's a good point. No, they're assessed separately, but the only three traits that we pull into the overall carcass merit are the weight of the carcass, the conformation of the carcass, and the fat class. I guess to include growth and carcass weight, you're almost double counting the genes for growth. At the end of the day, when you get paid, you solely get paid on the carcass weight. I think one of the weaknesses of that index that will change when we've got the knowledge to do that is the fact that it isn't taking into account days to slaughter. We almost have to look at that separately. And then that brings in the challenges. Okay, what's it worth to get lambs away a week earlier? But I'm sure we can overcome that. In the early years of the project, days to slaughter was probably one of our more challenging EBVs to sort out, but we had a eureka moment, and we did get that working well, and we've now got good heritabilities and confidence in the trait. So it's quite logical to get that built in the near future.
Thanks, Sam. And when you say there's a value of £3.50 to £4 per lamb, is that from all top 20% EBV rams or the best of the top genetics? What about those unrecorded rams?
Yeah, well, the figures I was pulling out was purely from the rams that come forwards on test. So they're not all top 10% rams, but they're all pretty high ranking. There aren't many breeders that actually want to put forward lower ranking animals. So in general, we've got high performing animals on test, and yet we can still see that £3.50 a lamb difference between those. I think it's very logical to say if we had a wider spectrum of rams and showed the true genetic variation that we know is out there amongst the recorded genetics, that difference would be wider. And with the unrecorded genetics, the truth is we don't know where those animals sit. We do know that over time, through a bit of the modeling work we're doing, the recorded genetics on average are significantly pulling away from the unrecorded genetics, particularly in terms of traits like muscling in the background. So yes, I pull that out probably as quite a conservative figure, and equally I can point to 2 or 3 other trials over the last 15 years that come out with either that figure or one that's a little bit higher, even allowing for inflation.
Brilliant, thank you. And what support is out there on getting started with using EBVs, please?
There's a few things that are available. Through AHDB, there are certainly some very good manuals that are available. Those are up online, but if you drop AHDB an email, we'll quite happily put them in the post to you as well. So those are just talking through breeding values from the point of view if you're heading off to a sale for the first time and want to know how to interpret the data. Equally, there's a couple of YouTube clips that I've put up recently, and they again talk you through step by step what the EBV means, how to interpret it, and how to understand the bar charts that you would see when you are heading to sales. So both of those are quite good starting points if you're heading out to buy rams for the first time.
Thanks, Sam, that's really helpful. Just going back to something you've mentioned earlier, you said that days to slaughter was not included in the overall carcass merit. Surely scan weight and growth rate must be included, and there is a good correlation between scan weight and days to slaughter?
Yeah, it isn't included at the moment. So some of the improvements in carcass weight due to the growth genes are picked up and rewarded, but ultimately the index is purely about the value of that lamb, and what we need to do is extend it and build days to slaughter in. So that is a next step to be done so that we can get that balance between speed of finish and value of lamb. The information's there, but it isn't pulled together into a single ranking this year.
Thank you. The next one is, given that you've mentioned tonight all about the benefits of using progeny data, should the UK sheep industry move to a system in which all abattoir data for individual lambs is collected and fed into a genetic evaluation? A future wish, perhaps?
I'm a man that's obsessed with data, so I'd say yes, that would be fantastic. I think we just need to remember that the slight challenge in that, you can send me thousands of abattoir records, but for it to be useful for me, I need to really know the sire and the dam, the age of that animal when it was killed, and whether it's a single or a twin. Those are sort of the 4 minimum bits of information that I need to actually analyze it and tease it apart and make sense of that data. Now, with cattle, we're very fortunate because we know the sire for a great number of the animals. That's recorded on the passport. We know the dam for all of them. An increasingly high proportion of sires are recorded on passports, and that's something that AHDB would very much encourage people to do, to put sires on passports. We know when they're born, and we also know whether they're singles or twins. So through a separate strand of AHDB funded work, we have the National Beef Evaluation, and through that, one of my colleagues, Alex Brown, can give you breeding values for carcass weight, conformation, fat class, days to slaughter for any beef cattle within the country. Because we have just that system, we have access to what I'm calling the BCMS data to create a super pedigree. We've got access to Breed Society records to supplement that. And we've also got a lot of abattoir data from the large abattoirs sharing that with us. So we're quite close to that scenario already on beef. That's almost an underutilized resource. On sheep, it's a little bit harder, Chloe, because we also need to know a bit more about those animals. And the obvious one is, who's the dad?
Thank you, Sam. Just want to mention as well, there are publications available on the use of EBVs from QMS and HCC as well.
There are. I've even written 1 or 2 of them. So yes, I can highly endorse some of those as well.
Thanks, Sam. Which trait is more important to overall profitability of lambs, days to slaughter trait or carcass conformation?
I think it depends on your system, and I think it depends on the variation. I mean, some farmers are just paid on a flat rate basis. So in that scenario, it is about weight and speed off the farm. The other thing to take into account is that sort of getting the crystal ball out to predict how prices are going to change over the season and what grass growth is going to look like over the season. Days to slaughter suddenly looks very valuable when you haven't got any grass. So it becomes more important in that scenario. Equally, there'll be producers that are actually targeting a later period during the season. They're less worried about days to slaughter. They're quite happy to have lambs ticking on and then selling them at a different time. So really important to think about your system and then think about your breeding objectives and then the genetics that will complement that.
Thank you. And why do you use AI as well as natural service, and how do you link between the commercial flocks involved with the project?
That's two good questions, because the second one answers the first, so that's good. So the reason that we're using AI is so that we can use at least one ram in each of the flocks. It's the sort of thing we used to do in the days of the sire reference schemes, for those that will remember those within our pedigree breeding program. So using the same ram on several flocks means that we can take into account the environmental differences between farms. So if one farm has a lot more grass than another and all the lambs are 2 kilos heavier than on the other farm, because you've got a reference ram, the system says, well, hang on, these are all half sibs. If there's a 2 kilo difference between the two, it isn't due to the ram. It might be due to the genetics they use. It might be due to the environment. We can take both of those into account. So AI, the reason we do it is because it creates that linkage, really good linkage between the farms. We are looking with some of the farms that have worked with us for several years, have actually already got quite good linkage and are using rams across seasons as well to help. So we might look to use natural service rams that are related to one another to try and create some of that linkage. But the ideal is always to use one ram in more than one flock. And obviously we can't move the rams about because of the biosecurity challenges as well as the logistics. So AI, I think, will always be a part of the project. And the nice thing about AI is very often you can get some absolutely stunning rams, you know, your top 1%ers, your rams that went for lots and lots of money. People are quite happy to say, well, there's 30 straws of semen, go for it.
Thanks, Sam. That leads nicely into this next question. Can we trial some progeny of the 350k Texel ram, please?
Yes, if the owner is listening, that was good of you to put that up. And yes, we'd love to have some of that semen. If you nominate that for us, we'd be delighted.
The next one is there a subsidy to help with CT scanning costs?
Yes, there is. It varies a little bit between region. Both HCC, QMS and AHDB have all been very keen supporters of the CT scanner. QMS have the slight advantage that the permanent base is in Edinburgh, so that helps as well, doesn't it, for the breeders in Scotland. So it's worth liaising with your levy board to find out how much support is available. AHDB is the one that I know off the top of my head. They typically put in, I think it's £55 a head towards the price of CT scanning. The cost for the mobile CT scanner is about £98 from memory, something around those lines. So breeders are still investing a fair chunk of their own money, and you have to remember they need to do 5 each as well. So, you know, both breeders are investing and levy is investing to get these animals CT scanned. There's quite a bit of information about CT scanning up on the website, and equally you can contact Kirsty McLean or John Gordon up at SIUC, and they'll be very helpful, and they'll give you all the right information about prices and tell you where they're going to be this season as well, because they have a mobile CT scanner. So if they have enough sheep, they can go nearly anywhere, providing there's power and a bit of concrete to stand it on.
Brilliant, thanks, Sam. And I know Bridget's put some information on CT scanning and various other bits in the chat, so everyone can have a look at those as well. Lots of information in the chat at the moment. The next question we have is the knowledge gained on carcasses and abattoir data going to help us get a carcass description for payment that is better than the current Europe system?
That isn't the initial intention from this work. So the intention from this work is working within the current grading system, we're using that as their phenotypes in the background. So there are plenty of others that will be working in that area. That's slightly outside of my expertise in terms of tonight.
Thanks, Sam. We have a statement here, I don't know what you think. Surely days to slaughter affects your carbon footprint.
Yeah, really important part of that story, getting lambs away more quickly, their overall energy required per kilo of lamb is reduced, and that is extremely important. Also, I would throw into the mix that having animals that put down more muscle relative to the amount of fat, surely they have to be more efficient as well from a carbon point of view. So that's important. And that's purely in terms of terminal sire attributes. I'm doing some quite nice work at the moment within our maternal breeding programs that I won't talk about tonight. But the other things to bear in mind there are factors like ewe longevity. So getting the ewes to last an extra season has a big impact on reducing her carbon footprint. Getting ewes to rear more lambs is always right at the top. If she successfully rears extra lambs, that has a massive impact on carbon footprint. So improving lamb survival also has a knock-on impact. And I think we also need to think about ewe mature size as well, and thinking a bit more about efficiency rather than just output. So how many kilos of lamb she produces relative to her size. So we're doing some quite nice work. There's quite a nice booklet from HCC that you can see on their website as well. I'm sure there are equivalents within QMS, but the HCC one springs to mind. So if people are interested about the carbon footprint story, I'd encourage them to go online and have a good read of that.
Thanks, Sam. We just have a couple of questions left, unless any sneak in the next minute or so. We have a question here on changes in consumer habits, and have we seen changes and demand for certain cuts? Because with all of this great work going on, we can breed what the customer wants depending on cut. I think it's worth saying that we have a team at AHDB that looks at consumer habits. So you can sign up to a newsletter that will update you every month or so on the trends that we're seeing in the supermarkets. I don't know if, Sam, you have anything to add to that?
No, I think you were rescuing me before I even got there, Chloe. So you're absolutely right. We do have some really good expertise, and that expertise probably isn't me. But I mean, the one thing that we are noticing is that people want cuts that they can cook and prepare relatively quickly. There's less time being spent in the home cooking, and so we need some greater versatility within the cuts. And the beauty is that we can now produce lamb carcasses that can do that. So we've got the ability to produce larger lambs that you can butcher in different ways, and we're less restricted in some of the cuts that we put in front of the consumer. So I think that is an important part of it. And the consumer doesn't want fat, but the beauty is that we're producing genetics that have, that aren't over fat these days. We've got the ability to do that much better than 15, 20 years ago.
Thank you, Sam. And the person that asked that question, if you'd like to sign up for the newsletter, just drop me a message in the chat and I'll sign you up for you. So the final question this evening, Sam, how much of a ram's EBV is driven by the EBV of his parentage versus actual weights and scan data?
Oh, you've got a tricky one right at the end. Okay, so the moment a ram is born and goes onto our database, then he gets breeding values, but they're solely based on mum and dad. So 50% from each, because he gets 50% of his genetics from each, and obviously nothing of his own performance. As he goes on and gets measured throughout his life, then the emphasis shifts more towards the animal's own measurements. And for high heritability traits like growth rate and muscling, quite a lot is actually based on that animal's performance relative to his other contemporaries within the flock. So he can change quite a bit from his parent starting point. That would be less so for low heritability traits like litter size, for example. Then he goes on to become a sire in his own right, and he has increasing numbers of progeny, and they have obviously a much greater bearing because there are so many records. So you get to a point where a ram's had 40 or 50 progeny. Actually, if we wiped out his own measurements on himself, it wouldn't have a massive bearing on his breeding values, because there's a lot more weight of information coming from the progeny. So all of that tends to be reflected in the accuracy values, and you see the accuracy values going up over time, but it's a slightly shifting picture depending on what's available for that animal at a moment in time.
Thanks, Sam. We have reached the end of the questions. That was quite a quick fire round, but I'm glad we've managed to answer everyone's question this evening. So that's brilliant. Thank you. And thanks to Bridget in the background, who's worked hard and sent us lots of information. And thanks to everyone at home for listening this evening. Please do get in touch if you have any further questions. And a reminder that this presentation and questions have been recorded in case you'd like to recap. They'll be on the AHDB Beef and Lamb YouTube channels. So thanks very much, and enjoy the rest of your evenings.
Thank you.